Royal succession is tricky business. And of course, 2 years ago when Queen Elizabeth died and Charles succeeded her on the throne, there was no real political machinations or behind-the-scenes intrigue, aside from maybe some people opining that Charles should abdicate in favor of his son. But historically speaking, that's really the exception, not the rule. Oftentimes, there's all sorts of terrible things that happen as people jockey for power. In the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan, their version of a king, sometimes the succession battle there led to terrible things. At one point, one sultan died, and there was a civil war among his sons and their various factions for power. The grandson of the victor in that, when he became sultan, decided that it should be legal for the sultans to have their brothers executed in order to prevent a similar catastrophe in future generations. And so fratricide became the law of the land, and this all sort of culminated when Mehmed III became sultan and he executed 19 of his brothers. People thought that was a little heavy-handed, so they changed the law so the sultans could only imprison rather than kill their brothers if they saw them as a threat. Now, royal succession in ancient Israel was also something of a mess, especially early on. Saul, of course, is the first king of Israel. He intends his eldest son, Jonathan, to succeed him on the throne. Of course, God intends for David to succeed, but Saul is not really into that. But Saul and Jonathan both die in the same battle. And so Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, tries to assert royal authority, and so begins a period of divided rule between David ruling in the south and Ishbosheth in the north. Even after David is able to consolidate power after the assassination of Ishbosheth, even then, things are messy. Now, David has a number of sons. The eldest is Amnon. The second eldest is Daniel. He's mentioned once and then vanishes from the narrative, so most scholars believe that he died as a youngster. Then there's Absalom and Adonijah, and these four guys all factor into all of this. Of course, Amnon, the guy who everyone would expect to succeed his father David, rapes Tamar, his half-sister. And so Absalom, Tamar's full sister, murders Amnon in revenge. Of course, maybe Absalom had an ulterior motive as well, because if the eldest son was going to succeed on the throne, by taking Amnon out of the way, he lines up his own position as the expected heir apparent. Now, he shows us that this ambition is true when he attempts a coup d'etat against his father that results in his death. Now, later in life, when David is clearly on the way out, he expresses a preference that his son Solomon, about 15 years the junior of his eldest living son, Adonijah, be the successor. But Adonijah exalts himself as king with the help of some of the important power brokers in the court. Of course, David knows that this is a death sentence for Solomon, who will be seen as a rival if Adonijah consolidates power. But he and Solomon and those backing him manage to sort of head off the coup, and Solomon becomes the new king in place of his father David, even before David's death. This is a fulfillment of a promise that God had given to David earlier on. In 2 Samuel 7:12-14, we read this: "For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod, like any father would do." So because Solomon is David's chosen successor, God singles him out for special treatment. After Solomon consolidates power, we read this story that's the most famous story maybe about Solomon, about how he asks for wisdom. It's found in 1 Kings 3:3-14. "Solomon loved the Lord and followed all the decrees of his father David, except that Solomon too offered sacrifices and burned incense at the local places of worship. The most important of these places of worship was at Gibeon. So the king went there and sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings. That night the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream, and God said, "What do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." Solomon replied, "You showed great and faithful love to your servant, my father David, because he was honest and true and faithful to you. And you have continued to show this great and faithful love to him today by giving him a son to sit on his throne. Now, O Lord my God, you have made me king instead of my father David, but I'm like a little child who doesn't know his way around. And here I am in the midst of your own chosen people, a nation so great and numerous they cannot be counted. Give me an understanding heart so that I can govern your people well and know the difference between right and wrong. For who by himself is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for wisdom. So God replied, "Because you have asked for wisdom in governing my people with justice, and have not asked for a long life or wealth or the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will give you a wise and understanding heart such as no one else has ever had or ever will have. And I will also give you what you did not ask for, riches and fame. No other king in all the world will be compared to you for the rest of your life. And if you follow me and obey my decrees and commands as your father David did, I will give you a long life." So Solomon does well in having an other-focused request. He could ask for things that directly benefit him, like the life of his enemies or wealth or long life or something. But instead, he asks for wisdom because he knows that he doesn't have what it takes to govern this people well. And so God is pleased that he's focusing on how he can serve other people, and so he gives him the wisdom that he asked for, and he also gives him wealth and fame, because God has given him the wisdom he needs in order to steward those things well. Now, the beginning of Solomon's reign shows great promise. Solomon, of course, famously builds the temple that replaces the tabernacle, the permanent structure dedicated to God's presence in Jerusalem. On top of that, he oversees a period of immense economic growth, and his fame and the fame of God spreads all over the world. The Queen of Sheba from a faraway land hears of Solomon's wealth and splendor and wisdom and goes to investigate the matter with her own eyes. And when she goes to leave, she confides in Solomon that she was initially skeptical that the things that she had heard were true, but now she feels that these accounts of his riches and his wisdom have actually been understated. So things seem to be going really well for Solomon. But there are warning signs. First of all, Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And he may have loved her, he may not have loved her, it may have been a political alliance. Whatever he felt about her, marrying the daughter of a king was a way of securing your border, of creating a military alliance between you and this other king. And so it seems that Solomon is trying to preserve the peace that he enjoys rather than by trusting God, by setting up a series of political alliances. Also, while the temple takes 7 years to build and is glorious, his palace takes 13 years to build. Now, maybe they had COVID protocols or work stoppages or supply chains mess-ups or something like that, but most likely it was just that his palace was far more swanky than the temple was, which not a good look. Now, in the law, there are rules governing the monarchy, and by this standard, Solomon maybe is in a bit of trouble. In Deuteronomy 17:16 and 17, it says, "The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself or send his people to Egypt to buy horses, for the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. The king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself." So how does Solomon do according to this scorecard? Well, first, about wealth in gold. It says each year Solomon received about 25 tons of gold. This did not include the additional revenue he received from merchants and traders, all the kings of Arabia, and the governors of the land. That amount of gold, incidentally, would be about $2.5 billion at Canadian in market value that it was at on Tuesday. And that's about 3 times the annual output of the Macassa mine, incidentally. Now, of course, kings in those days had far fewer responsibilities towards their citizens. They didn't have to pay for education, health care, social safety net programs, and limited infrastructure. So it seems that Solomon accumulated large amounts of wealth, but that wealth was centralized in the monarchy. Rather than using it to support the growth of his people or to alleviate their tax burden, he imposed a quite heavy tax burden on them and used his wealth for things like ostentatiously made thrones and gold dinnerware. Has anybody told this guy about heavy metal poisoning? Well, what about on horses? Well, it says that Solomon built a huge force of chariots and horses. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses. Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt and from Cilicia. Ooh, so he doesn't follow that. Well, surely he does better on the front about the women, right? Not so much. It says in 1 Kings 11, 1-3, now King Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyways. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord. So God gave Solomon so much, and yet in the end, despite all the wisdom that he had, the wealth and the power, his focus ceases to be on serving the people as it started out, and his focus becomes the pursuit that everybody else is doing. He gets sidetracked by money, sex, and power. Now, thankfully, no one in modern times is ever sidetracked by money, sex, or power. No, actually, that's pretty much what sidetracks everybody. The end of Solomon's reign is not nearly as auspicious as its beginning. Early on, he had peace all around him, but then the people that had been vassals and had been serving him and paying tribute to him decide that they'd rather be independent. And so now they break away, they rebel, and now he has to defend his kingdom and his territory in a way that he never had before. Also, the high taxation that he had done alienates the people within his own country. He has a successor that God appoints in Jeroboam, who begins to sort of vie for power. And God had promised him a long life if he had obeyed all his commandments. Now, we think that Solomon was only about 20 years old when he succeeded to the throne. And so he didn't actually live that long. Despite the 40-year reign, he died at about age 60, which is terrible by modern standards. By standards of kings in that world, that's about average for a king who wasn't assassinated. But he does not have the long life his father and Saul had both lived to be about 70. Ironically, perhaps most of all, despite Solomon's great wisdom, his oldest son and heir, Rehoboam, proves to be a fool. When he succeeds to the throne, he's asked to lessen the burden on the people, and the advisors tell him that's a good idea, but instead he doubles down and says that he's going to make things worse for the people, and the northern kingdom breaks away on account of his unwillingness to listen to their grievances. So in the end, Solomon's idolatry and avarice sow seeds for the division of his country and the exile of both Israel and Judah. The wisdom didn't end up mattering all that much because Solomon has a very negative legacy. Now, Solomon has a special place in God's plan. It says that he will be like a son to God. And this is all because of his connection to this king whose heart was after God's own heart. Well, if you think about it, this is also true of us. We are adopted as children of God on account of our connection to a king whose heart was fully yielded to God. And of course, a better king. Not just King David, but of course, King Jesus. Like King Solomon, we are invited to ask for whatever we want. In John chapter 14, 13 and 14, he says, "You can ask for anything in my name, and I will do it, so that the Son can glorify the Father." Yes, ask for anything in my name, and I will do it. Now, just as God said, ask for whatever you want to Solomon, and then said, okay, because you asked for the right thing, I will give it to you, I think that same sort of idea also applies in our instance here. God is saying, not that you can ask for anything you want and I'll give it to you, or else I would have a bigger bank account and a much more muscular body. Rather, he's saying that if I've given you a job to do and you need something, you ask me and I'm going to make sure that you are equipped to do what you need. Also, Solomon is promised wisdom, and we also are promised wisdom. In James, it says, if you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. He will not rebuke you for asking. The only requirement is that we trust that God will actually come through and give us the wisdom that we are asking for. So just like Solomon is given every advantage, adoption to sonship, he's given honor, he's given wisdom, he's given the ability to ask for what he wants, we are given those same advantages. But just like Solomon, we are responsible for how we use those advantages. Our legacy is determined by the choices that we make, even though God has given us everything that we need to succeed. But are we devoting our lives to the pursuit of God's things, or are we pursuing the distractions of this world? In the parable of the seed and the sower, Jesus talks about how the Son of Man sows the word into the world, and the condition of people's heart is like soil. Seeds grow really well in some types of soil and not so well in other types. And I think in the case of Solomon, and in our case, in sort of the affluent West, the one that strikes a nerve maybe is the seed that is sown among the thorns. Jesus describes it this way. He says, the seeds that fell among the thorns represent those who hear the message, but all too quickly, the message is crowded out by the cares and riches and pleasures of this life, and so they never grow into maturity. Solomon's potential is choked by the cares, riches, and pleasures of this life. If it happened to him, well, it can happen to us just as easily. His fate and his legacy were dependent on what he did with the good things that God had given him. In the end, he chose to go his own way. He chose to pursue things of lesser importance than the things that God had given him the wisdom to understand were most important. Just like Solomon, we are beloved children. But we must also use the things that God has generously provided us with in the pursuit of his agenda, his kingdom coming on earth as it is in heaven. Why should it work out for us any better than it did for him if we choose to use what God has given us to pursue the things that God has told us will not satisfy us? Our choices affect other people. When we choose to pursue lesser things in life, our choices negatively affect our children, our grandchildren, our coworkers, our neighbors, the strangers we meet on the street, the people we go to church with, just as Solomon's negative pursuit of the wrong things affected his family to come and his subjects in his kingdom. I know a lot of ex-Christians who are ex-Christians because the people that were Christians around them made selfish choices or made idolatrous choices. Maybe the people in their church were more interested in being legalist and being right and righteous in their own eyes than they were in loving God and being generous. Maybe if they saw the hypocrisy or the harm that Christian leaders have caused other people and they walk away in disgust. When Christians make selfish choices, then there are consequences, death-dealing consequences in the lives of other people. At the same time, most people who become a Christian through a relationship that they have with somebody who is a Christian. In other words, that person's life displays something of the love and the patience and the goodness of Jesus, and that makes that person curious enough to investigate this whole Jesus thing. And so if we choose well, our lives can bear a legacy of life to the people around us. And if we choose selfishly, our lives, like Solomon's life, can bear a legacy of death. Jesus calls us to be disciples, those who pursue his way rather than our own way. That means that we are supposed to march to the beat of a different drum, to be part of that new creation that is breaking into the old creation world. But if we live lives pursuing the idols of this world, what we're really saying is we'd like to be old creation, we just don't want to be held accountable for it. So let's not take our eyes off the ball. Instead, we need to focus our time and energy on things of the greatest importance. Not things that seem important now, like money, sex, and power, but will not be important when everything is considered. So let's follow the advice of Jesus, who tells us, do not worry about these things, saying, what will we eat? What will we drink? What will we wear? These things dominate the thoughts of unbelievers, but your heavenly Father already knows all your needs. Seek the kingdom of God above all else, and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need. Amen.